UFOs are a topic that has fascinated people for decades. While many of the most well-known cases come from the United States, they are far from the only ones. So for this video, we'll look at a UFO sighting that occurred right here in Sweden. In the early hours of the 3rd of February 1984, 40-year-old Ante was heading home to Pinnso after spending the evening with friends in nearby Ingelstad. It was late at night, roughly 1 AM, and it was snowing heavily. Ante was driving at a steady speed, despite the slippery road, around 80 kilometers per hour. He would only slow down as he approached a section of the road where he knew that animals were prone to cross. Animals such as deer and moose. Slowing down and now focusing intently on the road for any animal that might be thinking of crossing the road, he then noticed a dark figure standing on the left side of the road. Given the size of this figure, he initially thought that it was a child, and found himself wondering what they were doing there so late at night. Not enough to stop though, so he kept creeping along the road slowly. Then, also to the left, he noticed a large, dark object that was hovering just above the treetops. Now he brought his car down to almost a complete stop to try to get a better look at this strange craft. It was massive, and it reminded him of a submarine. In later interviews, Ante would estimate its length to be somewhere between 75 to 90 meters. But he also said that he couldn't be sure. Now creeping along at a snail's pace, he rolled down the window to listen more closely. But the only sounds he heard were the rumbles of his own car. Other than that, it was completely silent. His mind would then drift back to the figure he had spotted on the side of the road, and now wondering if that person was witnessing the same thing that he was, he turned to where he had last seen that figure. There was nothing. The figure was gone. Now convinced that what he was seeing was a flying saucer, Ante would roll his window back up and speed off. He wanted to take a photo of this craft, but had left his camera at home. So he sped home, probably faster than legal. Once home, he ran inside to look for his camera and startled his wife. He told her that he was heading back out because he had seen a UFO or flying saucer and he was going to get a photo of it. Finding his camera, he then grabbed it and ran back outside. Speeding back, he arrived at the location at around 1:30 AM. While heading there, he suspected that most likely there would be nothing there when he got back. And when he arrived, he found that he was right. There was nothing there. No craft, no figure. But he lingered in the car in the area for a few minutes, hoping to get another look at it. But neither the craft or the figure would show up. Now, disappointed, he decided to start up the car again and head home. Approaching the T-junction, where he intended to make a U-turn, Ante suddenly found himself slamming on the brakes. That dark craft that he had previously seen was now positioned directly in the middle of the road. His sudden braking caused his car to spin out of control, and it ended up landing in a ditch on the left side of the road. Once the car had stopped, Ante would check himself for any injuries before he turned and looked at the spot where the strange craft had been, but it was no longer there. Now he began to doubt himself. Maybe he had imagined the whole thing. Maybe there was no craft there at all. He once again decided to head back home. The car was now firmly trapped in the snow, and he could not drive it out, so he decided to get out of the car to see if he could free it some other way. But almost immediately as the car door opened, an unseen force would grab his left arm, or rather, the jacket that he was wearing. He could not see anything. No arms, no legs, not even a face. but he could clearly feel the strong grip on his arm. Whoever or whatever this attacker was, it was very strong, and it pulled him out of the vehicle as if he weighed nothing. Now panicked, Ante tried fighting off this attacker while he was screaming for help. During this struggle, his right arm would be grabbed by a second unseen force, but he kept struggling and even managed to free one of his arms. He started swinging wildly and ended up landing a punch on the head of one of his attackers, or at least what he thought was the head, sending it sprawling to the ground, seemingly unconscious. A third attacker would then run up. It wrapped its arms around his back and started dragging him away. Looking back at this creature that was at his back, he then spotted the craft again. It was hovering nearby, and now terrified, Ante started struggling even more. He would then notice headlights of an approaching vehicle breaking through the trees and felt some degree of hope. And for whatever reason, this is when his attackers suddenly released him. Now on the ground, he found himself crawling back to his car. Once he made it inside the car, he found himself just sitting in the driver's seat. His entire body was tense and shaking. His feet were soaked. His hands were tingling. The next thing he remembers is seeing two figures next to the vehicle. Still on high alert, he quickly locked the door and shouted at them to stay away. He then noticed their uniforms. It was two police officers. The officers would then guide Ante out of his car and to their police car, where they transported him to the nearest hospital. Something that Ante later would reflect on as being very strange was the fact that the officers did not say much. They just took him to the hospital. At the hospital, Ante was subjected to a series of routine questions. That is, until he mentioned his encounter with the UFO. After that, the tone of the questioning would shift. The staff now wanted to know if he had been drinking, or if he had used any substances that could potentially influence his state of mind. According to Ante, he told them that no, he had not been drinking, he had not taken anything, and he did not drink alcohol at all. Obviously, the staff at the hospital did not believe him. Ante would be taken to a psychiatric ward, and after a 3-day evaluation, he was discharged and returned home. There, he would learn that the police wanted to speak to him. He would comply fully with their requests, and even made a point to ask the officers to handle this situation as discreetly as they could, which they agreed to do. And that should have been the end of it. Now let's look at the events of that night from the perspective of the police. Because in the early hours of February 3rd, 1984, the phone would ring at the police station in Växjö. The caller identified himself as Bengt Johansson from Kristianstad. He wished to report something strange that he had seen. According to Johansson, while driving from Växjö, he noticed a vehicle parked on the roadside with its lights turned off. But the strangest part was that he had seen a dark object with no lights hovering just above the car. He also believed that he had seen a person either inside the car or just outside of it, but he also said that he did not stick around to find out. This whole thing had scared Johansson so much that he quickly turned his car around and sped back to Växjö. Once there, he found a phone booth and called the police. 2 police officers were then sent out to investigate. When they arrived at the scene, they found Ante sitting in the driver's seat. He was visibly shaking. He was tense and he was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Once he released the steering wheel, his fingers were bent, almost like he was miming claws. He was still visibly in shock by the time he arrived at the hospital. By now he was hyperventilating, staring blankly into nothingness and only giving short answers to any question that was asked. The medical staff would administer Valium, which at first did not have much of an effect, but after a couple of minutes, Ante fell asleep. When he woke, he was in a state of anxiety. After telling the doctor about his encounter with this UFO, the doctor would call and speak to his wife, who told him that Ante had no prior history of mental illness. Despite that, the doctor concluded that Ante had suffered a mental shock. He would then be admitted to Sankt Sigfrids Hospital in Växjö, where he stayed for 3 days. Ante would later state in interviews that he has many gaps in his memory from this evening. For instance, he remembers seeing the 2 police officers approaching the car, and he remembers being at Sankt Sigfrids Hospital, but he does not remember much of anything in between those 2 events. After dropping Ante off at the hospital, the police officers went back to the site of the incident to search for any clues. It was now no longer snowing, so they could clearly see a series of tracks in the snow. It looked like someone had walked in one direction, kicked up a lot of snow as if struggling with someone, before turning back towards the car. From what they could see, these were all the tracks of only one person, which they assumed was Ante, since as far as they knew, he was the only one who had been there at the time. This particular area had a significant military presence, and because of that, the police did not want to dismiss this case without a thorough investigation. So once Ante was home from hospital, the police would reach out to him, and he was then taken back to the scene where they conducted further interviews. Despite Ante's initial intention to keep his experience private, the story did end up becoming public. In a 1984 interview, Ante revealed that during his time in the hospital, people had shown up at his home, had harassed his wife and children, had even accused him of being a spy. As I mentioned before, there was a military presence in that area. The road that Ante traveled on was a designated road base that could potentially serve as a runway for military aircraft. And the area is surrounded by hangars and bunkers. Because of that, Ante found himself accused of spying on the government and whatever project it may have been working on that they did not want the public to see. This and the harassment of his wife and his children would enrage Ante enough that he decided to share his story with the world. As I mentioned in the beginning, UFO cases from countries outside of the US are not as well known, but within the country itself, it does garner some attention. That's true for this case as well. It has garnered a lot of attention within the community of UFO enthusiasts here in Sweden. I first encountered this story in a book by Claes Svan. Svan is well known for having an interest in the bizarre and the paranormal, and has become sort of a go-to source for many strange stories. One question that I found myself asking when I was looking into this case was how Ante was able to see the craft hovering above the treetops, especially since he described it as being very dark or black with no lights. From pictures taken in that area where Ante was showing what happened, it looks like the surrounding area is nothing but large trees with little to no streetlights. As for the figure he saw and the second time he saw the craft, those were both illuminated by the headlights of his car. The mysterious caller, Bengt, also saw the craft straight on when he was approaching the scene with his car. Ante would be interviewed many times by Svan, and during these interviews he not only told of this strange encounter, he also told of other strange experiences he has had with these mysterious beings. one of which that happened just a month after the initial incident. According to Ante, in March 1984, he was watching TV one evening when he suddenly felt a strange urge to go outside. And giving in to this feeling, he stepped out onto the street, where he then noticed a tall figure in the distance, standing close to a street light. Somehow feeling that this figure and this feeling he was having were connected, he tried approaching the figure. But whenever he drew closer, this man mysteriously vanished, only to reappear further away. Feeling compelled to follow this man, Ante would follow him until they reached a meadow approximately 600 yards from his house. There he spotted a dark craft that appeared to be hovering. A craft that was very similar to the one he had encountered before, only smaller. Then, out of nowhere, he started feeling the sensation of being lifted off the ground. And as he felt himself getting lifted higher and higher, he heard a reassuring voice in his head. This voice told him that he didn't have to be afraid. Then, out of nowhere, Ante found himself standing in his backyard. He would then look up at the sky and see 4 glowing orbs that moved towards a dark craft, possibly the same one that he had seen before. When closer to the bigger craft, the orbs began to hover around it before they vanished, and as soon as they did, the craft would shoot up into the sky and disappear. According to Ante, this was only the beginning. From that moment until his passing in 2019, Ante reportedly had numerous interactions with these beings. Meetings that included conversations in Swedish, where Ante's dialect apparently created some issues from time to time, as well as meetings where they gave him gifts or visions of future events. Ante would start writing down these strange encounters, which left him with hundreds of pages of strange meetings. Some of these experiences were even featured in a book that he co-authored with writer CO.AG in 1989. As far as any theories trying to explain what Ante saw that night, there really aren't that many. In fact, most people point to the doctor's diagnosis as the most likely explanation, suggesting that he may have suffered from shock or experienced hallucinations that were triggered by a psychotic episode. This is not an uncommon interpretation in these types of stories. I've looked into similar cases for other videos, and a common theme from many of these people who see strange things is a fear of ridicule, and how that plays a significant role in their choice to stay silent. This is also a reason that many have given for why they have chosen to share whatever stories they have anonymously. That way, if no one believes them, they don't have to suffer the ridicule, scrutiny, or suggestions that they've lost their mind. Anonymous posters on internet forums calling your story fake is easier to deal with than having to face that ridicule in your everyday life. And as for Ante, he has always been willing to talk about this unusual experience. And he has been interviewed multiple times, and he's even given lectures. But he has also always been willing to entertain the possibility that there may be alternative explanations for what he has encountered, aside from the supernatural. It's both fascinating and terrifying how the human mind can warp reality. I'm not saying that that's what happened in this case, but it's a very, very real thing that does happen. In the case of Ante, there is another witness, so to speak. The one person who could corroborate this whole story. The mysterious man who contacted the police that night. The man called Bengt Johansson. But unfortunately, he has never been found, despite numerous attempts by field investigators from UFO Sweden to track him down. The name Bengt Johansson is a pretty common one And investigators trying to find him have interviewed other men sharing that same name in the area, but all of them have denied being the caller. This has led to speculation that he may not have been a local, possibly someone just passing through, or that he used a fake name to protect his own identity. There is a police report that someone did call, and considering that this was the 1980s, where mobile phones were not that widely used, it's unlikely that it was Ante. Another detail is that Ante's description and the police reports of the events that occurred after the police showed up does match. And Ante also described seeing the headlights of a car that was approaching as he struggled against his unseen attackers, which possibly was the mysterious caller or even the police as they approached the area. The bottom line is that it's pretty safe to say that something did happen, but we can't be sure what. A UFO encounter that kept going for years, or a car accident caused by a form of psychosis or mental break. We can't say with certainty which of these is the more accurate description of what happened that night. In fact, when it comes to this case, it's not that night that most people have a problem with. It's the additional events, the additional experience that Ante claimed to have that most people struggle with. The visions, the conversations, the gifts. It's a bit too much for a lot of people and feels a lot like embellishing. But to his credit, Ante has acknowledged that. He has been quoted as saying that he doesn't really know if this whole thing was an external or internal experience. That the only thing that he knows for sure is that this experience was and is very, very real to him, whatever that may mean. In the end, the only thing we know for sure is that something did happen that night in 1984. What that something was is unclear. And that is a point that is true whether you believe Ante or not. What do you think happened?